Welcome to our seminar, Everything is Energy. And today I'm very, very happy to introduce Nina Callahan to you. She's a researcher and a lecturer at the Center for Sustainability Transitions at Stellenbosch University. And the transition she is studying is South Africa's energy transition. Her main focus is on the role of governance in these transitions, and she has co-edited and also contributed to a book depressingly called Anatomy of State Capture, which is not a high point in our history. So in her talk today, given that we are still experiencing this hangover from the debauchery of state capture and a serious energy crisis, Nina will explore much needed possibilities for institutional rebuilding. She's looking for examples of more promising governance practices. And as far as I can tell from her abstract, these will be forms of relational governance. So Nina, we're very, very interested in what you propose. Thanks so much for being willing to share your ideas with us. And yeah, I'll hand over to you.
Great. Thank you, Andrea, and thanks everybody. It's really good to be here, and thank you for hosting. Yeah, I'm going to quickly share my screen and let me know if it's got a funny view on. Okay.
Nina, it does have that next slide view.
Okay. How about that?
Perfect. That's perfect. Thanks.
Okay, great. So I work at the CST, and we've been studying governance across a range of transition domains. I come from an applied development background, so it's been really interesting for me to turn over the more academic articulations of what governance and development are. And in this presentation, I'd like to share my motivation for the study, the conceptual framework, and then the application of the literature to the case study of the Presidential Climate Commission and some of the findings from that study. So, yes, Andrea, it might have been and is a really depressing and low point in our history, but state capture was actually the inspiration for this study. And it started in 2019 when I joined the research team at the CST, and we put together this book, Anatomy of State Capture, with case studies that were contributed by many of our colleagues, among them Songezo Zibi, Marianne Tam, Lauren Hermanus, Open Secrets, the Development Policy and Research Unit at UCT, among many, many others. And what was really interesting in this set of cases was to study how state capture went about its institutional business, to try and understand the racket of predatory power, how it actually worked, and how it managed to do an incredible amount of political and institutional work over the 9 years that we can identify. So in the ways that it controlled rents and manipulated procurement, in the ways that it weakened accountability and maintained legitimacy. What was very interesting to observe was that this predatory project was decentralized, but it was multinodal and highly networked. It had a high degree of complicity, collusion, coercion, and collaboration. And it was mission driven. It had a very clear understanding that it was using state offices, processes to loot the state. And so for me, what really started to emerge were relational features of state capture. It really depended on relationships, on making agreements and deals very explicitly, sometimes very violently in the ways that it went about facilitating these agreements and deals. There was also an understanding of the ecosystem of value that everybody contributed to. There was a clear understanding of roles. And there's a figure here that really characterizes what kind of roles people played. There were political elites, internal fixers, external fixers, middlemen, brokers, corrupt corporates, everybody really working very purposefully in this ecosystem of predatory power. What was also interesting to observe was the kind of influence and enrollment that state capture actors enacted with each other, and that was also characterized by a high degree of violence. And there was a clear motivation for rewards and benefits, and there were also sanctions if one didn't comply. And what emerged was a picture of predatory relational governance. And I thought, wow, here is a practice of the very dark arts of relational governance. What would a developmental relational governance actually look like? At the time, there were no really promising, and I think still not, there aren't really very promising examples of how we rebuild state capability and how we rebuild institutions, what a more generative and inclusive governance practice looks like within the state. And as SOEs and other state institutions really try and restore their operations, their capacities, and beyond really assembling a winning team, I wanted to inquire what goes on inside institutions in this mission to rebuild and reconstruct in the shadow of state capture. So the Presidential Climate Commission was chosen as a case study here with the idea that it had potentially low-hanging fruit. And it would probably provide a high degree of concept validity, meaning that in the ways that I understood relational governance, I would be more able to identify it in this organization. But the intention is also to study other state-owned enterprises and state organizations who are making some progress in rebuilding. The South African Revenue Service is another case study that I'm really interested in to try and observe what is relational in the ways these rebuilding practices are happening. So I put up a quote here from the president and his SONA speech in 2023 that talks about a high level and I think a shared idea of what relational governance could be, and especially in the ways that the PCC is aiming for, and that it's about inclusive and collective decision-making that incorporates a wide membership of our social partners, and especially those that are most affected in the transition. So the overarching relational premise, or what I was hoping to find and see, was that the PCC aims for decarbonized development and for justice outcomes, that it appreciates different scales and effects of transition in an unequal society, that it's in the business of managing complex relationships, and it is involved in planning and coordination, especially around the just transition. So when I was searching for what is relational governance, how do other people understand it, I couldn't find a typology, if you want to call it that. I couldn't find a neat heuristic that told me what I should be looking for. And so what we did within the CST and in our different research groups was that we looked at some of the literature that we had been covering to understand state capture. And we also looked at the literature that has been talking about the just energy transition and how we might facilitate it and how we might theorize it. So in assembling this literature, one of the areas was about theorizing the state. And here, drawing on some heavyweights, Jessup, Foucault, and Poulantzas, who really theorized the state as a social relation and an assemblage of institutions. This, for me, had some value in understanding that the state is perhaps much more fragile than we think it is, and that if we think about it as a collection of institutions, there might be more space for concentrated action, more strategic action, instead of thinking about the state as this monolith and bulwark and, that somebody is really at the wheel and driving this massive institution. What this theory really did was kind of open up and create a more spacious picture where governance could be about managing a set of complex relations. And Bob Jessup especially theorizes a way of doing this, and he calls it collaboration, which is moving between the modes of governance, solidarity, dialogue, exchange, and hierarchy, to produce different kinds of political effects. So this was a really generative start to assembling the conceptual framework. The next one was about political settlements. And Mushtaq Khan really presents a typology of political settlements, talking about the arrangements of power. And it sets the meta logic for governance and for development. So who constitutes the political settlement enables very particular kinds of development to happen. And it's a settlement about sharing power, sharing risks, responsibilities, costs and benefits, and creating coalitions for efficiency. So efficiency does not mean justice. It does not automatically mean good development, but it's about creating the conditions for development or certain kinds of development to happen. Behuria, Burr and Gray and Whitfield really take the political settlements literature and view it through an industrial policy lens, which I thought was really interesting, especially for our context in the energy transition. The next kind of scaffold in this relational governance framework was about building state capability. How do we actually translate theories, programs, and policies into action? And it's a literature about the competence to implement. What is the characteristic of our institutions? Do they mimic others, mainly to accrue some kind of social and political capital, to make it look proper, even if the structures are not able to actually deliver. The idea of premature load bearing was an interesting concept in the set of literatures, where institutions that are immature are often tasked with very, very complex tasks that they're not able to do. And so failure to implement is one of the results. Andrews, Borain, Mazzucato, and Pritchard, they really talk about building state capability around solving local problems that are very, very clearly defined. And Andrews et al. Propose a problem-driven iterative adaptation, or PDIA. And it's really a method of trying to deconstruct a problem in a way that gives a clear problem statement, and then sets of kind of smaller actions and deconstructing a big problem into kind of smaller problems to make managing complexity a lot more approachable and doable. And the last in the scaffold is institutional work. And it studies the work of individuals inside of institutions. What are their purposive actions? And Lawrence and Sudabi talk about people's actions that create, maintain, and disrupt institutions. And this is, for me, it's probably one of the most fascinating areas to understand how institutions kind of reproduce themselves, how they change, how they're forced to change with like landscape pressures bearing down, and to understand how individuals can express agency within the constraints of an institution, bringing in kind of the old arguments of form versus function. And so together, this set of literatures were read together. I don't think they've been put together in another study that I've come across. And for me, they created a scaffold for relational governance and to try and understand the scales where change happens and how we could go about enacting this change and shaping this change. So what I did was to try and apply the literature to the case study. And I did some interviews with members of the commission, both the secretariat and commissioners themselves, and asked them questions from the insights from the literature, kind of the main ideas, to see if these were indeed reflected inside of the PCC. How we can understand the PCC and its relationship to the state. We know that it came out of the Job Summit of 2018, as well as the National Planning Commission's social dialogues between 2018 and 2019. And so it's really, the PCC has been assembled from other state processes, and it's gotten templates, if we can call it that, around how it needs to engage with social partners. And this was really taken from the NPC social dialogues. It's very interestingly positioned in an interstitial space within government, so it faces multiple directions, and it needs to represent diverse social partners. And perhaps in this way, we could describe it as a political hybrid. What was interesting is that it also didn't start off with what we call constitutional rules. And this was a point of uncomfortability, I think, for some of the commissioners, because they didn't come in with a term of reference to clearly articulate and describe how they will work together and to what ends. How the PCC and commissioners came together was that they coalesced around the mission. So how do we understand the just energy transition, and what is the work of creating a national consensus around this idea? And so kind of ways of working and the rules of how this new political hybrid kind of held itself together was more of an exploratory and kind of on the floor exercise rather than an administrative exercise. And for that to happen within a set of state institutions was really interesting to observe. It eventually did get to some rules and in terms of reference, but that came out of the work. What we can understand is that the PCC is also involved in navigating great complexity, not only around the multiple areas of consideration for a just transition, but also navigating state complexity and the complexity of relationships inside of the state and between institutions. It relies very heavily on the science community for research and tries to take that research to consultation with social partners to arrive at a true consensus or agreed consensus. And this distinction is really interesting to me in how we can think about relational practices. True consensus, I understand, is that everyone really, really agrees. We can confirm these are a reflection of our values, our convictions, our politics. Whereas agreed consensus is much more negotiated. And even where there are opposing opinions, in the interest of a collective agenda, an agreed agenda, there is a negotiated settlement to accept the decision making. And so some of these quotes were really, I pulled out of the study to share with you to try and illustrate the kinds of considerations, the kinds of relational practices that members of the Commission engage with. Especially the quote, we have to be very precise. We've got to listen carefully, understand the consensus that's formed and give expression to it. If we are biased in one way or another and we don't give adequate expression to the consensus, then we lose trust. And that's by interviewee 2. And I found that really interesting, especially when we look to the PCC to set the direction of this just transition, when we look to them to set the register of how we understand this business of justice and what it looks like, that it cannot really set those agendas by itself. It needs to be an instrument and a translator of what ideas come from social partners. The other notice from some of the interviews was that the PCC is really stepping into spaces of lack, spaces where the state is not performing well. And it bears quite a heavy burden in the ways that it goes into communities to try and elicit ideas and feedback from some of the research and some of the recommendations that they're putting together, but actually have to deal with a society that feel very abandoned, that suffers greatly from a lack of service delivery. And so it really has to navigate all of the deficits of the state when engaging with communities. What was also a point to note for some of the commissioners was that local government particularly is a weakness within the tiers of government, and that there also wasn't local government representation on the commission, which was acknowledged as a gap. So from here, we could really understand this state as an assemblage of institutions, as a complex social relation, in the ways that the PCC has to facilitate and understand contestation. It serves a diplomatic function within a fractious state and a low trust environment. And perhaps we could go so far as to characterize it as a collaborative intermediary. Even though it tries to kind of maintain an identity that is independent of the state, in that it doesn't drive solely state agendas, it is very interdependent because it is defined and received by society by what the state does and does not do. It's also attempting to build theory for a just transition and to make the theoretical case for how that could transpire. And there was some very constructive feedback from other colleagues, academics, practitioners, who really pushed back on some of the PCC's articulations, most specifically in the document, the Just Transition Framework. And the PCC was criticized for a liberal technocratic emphasis that is not transformative enough. And when inquiring with some of the commissioners about this technocratic approach and flavor of their work, they accepted it quite generously, and then also tried to explain that it's gone the technocratic route because of a limited capacity and capability within the state, and that it's a useful capability, especially in navigating great complexity. But I think the critique is also about how deeply may we transform as a society and in our economy through the work of what the PCC is trying to do. And I think that's a very valuable question, especially when we understand who sets the register for that transformation, how deep or how shallow, and what is the PCC's role within that constellation, which really brings us to political settlements. And it is perhaps reflective of some of the critiques that commissioners and members of the Secretariat were very measured about how much a political settlement could be displaced or reformed in the just energy transition. Two quotes specifically is interviewee 2 and interviewee 1. How do we use this opportunity to move us away from the widening inequality gap? We're not going to fix it in the just transition. I think that would be naive. But the fact that we've got people within the Commission and the Secretariat saying nothing about us without us is mainstreaming civil society language, and that's something. The other interviewee also talks about big MEC players, and that those players have a role to play in the just energy transition, but that they might not do it in the exploitative way as they have done. But large monopoly capital still has a very strong role in the ways that it can be a powerful player within a political settlement, and also the resources that it brings to the process of a just transition. So for political settlements, we can think about the PCC as setting a common agenda amongst the diversity of social actors and enrolling all kinds of savory and unsavory bedfellows for what they can bring to kind of the doability of a deal. I think the PCC is also playing an important role with disrupting the theories and institutions around South Africa's coal regime economy. And it's also remaking a political settlement around energy in the way that it valorizes the social and economic benefits of renewable energy. So for me, what was interesting to notice was that the political settlement is not just the meta-narrative or the meta-logic, but it also happens at different scales between different partners. And it has the ability to form new coalitions. That was also one of the notice, that the red and green coalition between Labour and the environmental movement has kind of been relinked or partially restored through the work of the PCC, and that these conversations are much more alive. So it really gives us a possibility of what kind of coalitions are possible in an idea of a transition and forming a new political settlement. Just to finish off the last institutional scaffold, which is relational scaffold, which is institutional work within the Presidential Climate Commission. And one can observe institutional work in the PCC across all of its domains of action, with all of its social partners inside of the state, with society. But one really clear notice for me was a coalition of environmental groups and commissioners who come from environmental groups, who really used their social and political expertise to insist and shape certain kinds of processes within the PCC. One of the main ways that this institutional work was enacted was how a more ambitious NDC was advocated from the PCC, but also the process of how the PCC engages community and engages dialogue. And these commissioners made a really big input in that process, because prior to the advocacy, the PCC had a very different idea of what community consultation would look like. This is also one of the points of criticism, that it's not robust enough, it's not deep enough, and perhaps it's not reflective enough of the real voices of people. But I think understanding that this drive and this impetus has come from a certain coalition of commissioners themselves is a really important way to understand how commissioners inside of this organization agitate amongst themselves in the way that they form an identity of the PCC. But it also comes at a big cost for those commissioners. They are not from well-resourced organizations. They don't have kind of institutional or financial support to be able to do this very strenuous work, I think, within the PCC. And so that's not really sustainable when we think about this broad swathe of action that the PCC needs to facilitate. So in conclusion, I think that each of the scaffolds of the conceptual framework found some purchase in the PCC and reflected some really interesting findings. The PCC as intermediary and translator between society and the state is a really critical role to play, especially when information and capability and mandates to understand a just transition, and each of our roles within that is held very unequally between social partners and within the state. It's really working towards building capability, I think, in complex environments where we hope we're going where we're going, but we're not sure if we're really going there. Ways for collaborative problem solving. And then I think there's much more potential for the PCC's convening power amongst state institutions themselves. I still have a question around the depth of transformation and justice. Can it be set at a singular organizational level within a broader institutional set? How do we get that register of driving deeper justice for deeper outcomes? And then a really interesting insight about supporting the agents of change, those people who are disruptive in ways that shape change processes. Could we be able to support them and recognize the diversity of institutional work and the value that it brings to processes of change? Thank you.
Nina, thank you very much. Sorry, I just had to find all my buttons again and press them on. Sure, that a whole lot of questions floating around my mind, but I think let's open the floor to everyone and anybody who wants to chat now. Janet, and then Gary. Okay. So Janet.
Hi, sorry, I'm just rejoining you. So, look, it's only really the three of us here to engage with you, and Yemisi's here too. So, I
actually introduce you. Lungelo's here with me.
No, Nina, thank you. I thought that was really fascinating, and I really like some of the theoretical frameworks you used. So, I've got some more applied questions for you, explorations, we can say. So the big one is the one about consensus and the role that the PCC can play in this, because if its objective is to create some kind of national consensus about the transition from fossil fuel, how does one accommodate different material interests? So you're phrasing this as quite abstract, you know, like there are these different interest groups and you have a process, it's a sort of a relational thing, like a relationship between these different interests and how they're accommodated in a negotiated settlement and so on. But actually there are real differences in interest. So there are coal mining interests, there are fossil fuel company interests, which are pushing back hard against this transition, and they are countervailing in this process. So, I mean, we had a very interesting climate justice coalition workshop here about a month ago at Pine Lodge, and labor movement was very strongly represented, they are very, very, very skeptical of the PCC. They're very skeptical. They do not trust it. They do not think that it is going to be able to weigh up those, to find a pro-labor balance in that weighing up of the different interests. I don't know if I'm being clear about this, but I find this whole premise so fascinating, because as a sort of materialist scholar, I don't think that you can always meet all interests. You can't please everybody.
No.
The PCC actually explicitly says this. We're going to please everybody. We're going to find a way forward which will please everybody.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's possible.
I don't know if it's possible neither.
Can I make another reflection?
Yes.
About the thing about relational governance and so on is fascinating. So, I mean, I don't want to get into too much personal detail, but think about, you started off by talking about the Zondo Commission, and think about just our local context. The Watson brothers, Gavin Watson, who was integral to this whole Bosasa story, with Linda MT, who is from PE, who's the head of ANC intelligence, Ronnie Watson involved with ANC intelligence, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
That whole network, okay, integrally involved with state capture and the Lindela repatriation camps and so on, which I'm going to talk about at lunchtime. So there's a network there, which we are living here in Gqeberha. Some of us who've been involved here for a long time are very familiar with this network. Mm-hmm. And that then, anyway, that's the one network. The other network is a network around the PCC and people like Vali Musa and Crispian Olva and so on, who have also been working together for decades and decades and decades, since before the ANC was unbanned even, mm-hmm. and working on local government transitions and so on. So they've got a whole relational network themselves.
Yes, they do.
And a whole political practice, which they are, so, and I've got to say, I mean, I've had personal experience with both of these networks. So I have some kind of sense of how they operate. Mm-hmm. And for me, it's fascinating to do this analysis, like to apply it to an institution like the PCC, mm-hmm. Quite apart from the actual work of, what it's doing in terms of the just transition.
Yeah.
But just to see how these relationships operate.
Yeah. Yeah. For me, Janet, that was a very pointed question in my interviews about the social currency and the political currency of some of the members of the commission, and how strongly they shape processes or the ways of working within this kind of forming and norming and storming ways. And it's interesting to accept power, influence, and social currencies as part of a relational practice, and trying to discern then when it's good and when it's not. because what was interesting to me in first the study of state capture is that this was very highly relational, and it could have been harnessed for transformative ends had it not been for the very narrow interests served. But just taking the institutional dynamics and the interpersonal dynamics as a practice and trying to understand what does it look like for a developmental project. So I think the relational aspect is a very slippery slope. And I think there has to be kind of many eyes on it and voices in it to reflect kind of really what's happening. on your other point, I'm also not sure if we can please anyone. For me, in the ways that I've been politicized, is not everybody wins. And some people have been winning for a really long time.
Yeah,
so at what point is there a payback or a restitution or a redress? And for me, those kinds of questions are not very strong in the ways that the PCC does its work. It's very much around what is doable, having to harness the social forces, the finance, the relationships of power within existing players. So I don't think it's a very deeply transformative action. And I think commissioners, even inside the PCC, are very aware of that. They're not blind to it. Like there wasn't some grand idea that we're going to change the social, political, economic fabric of South Africa, but we're going to try a new configuration of these actors. And I appreciated that realism, if in my head, realism. Yeah.
Thanks, Nina. Can we bring Gary into the conversation?
Yeah. Thanks, Andrea, and thanks, Nina. That was excellent. I want to get hold of that book. So I wanted to, so very similar to Janet, have very similar experiences, and also understand the sort of network, the system of the networks that sort of govern the country. And I was just thinking through like the TRC, the Planning Commission, the Minimum Wage Commission, the Fees Must Fall Commission, NEDLAC, the Zondo Commission, all of these commissions that have been set up that are they're not state institutions per se, but they are these multi-party sort of Zondo wasn't a negotiation forum, but I was interested that one of your commissioners said that the labor and capital haven't been working that well together, but NEDLAC has been continuing and doing a lot of work, So I was interested just to go back to the start there in terms of the work that you did on the state capture. If we look at South Africa in terms of our constitution, the laws, the values in which we approach the transition, you wouldn't have guessed that the networks that exist at the moment and run the country would have lost. I don't know if we've lost their way in the sense of the developmental agenda that we set ourselves in the 90s, so because I share your, my experience of working with communities is this feeling of abandonment and this feeling of service delivery, lack of service delivery and that kind of stuff. But there's not an end of apartheid as the hope for transition. There isn't a coming event that says to communities, there's some hope to have you. This is now the state of play. And I was just wondering, from your research on state capture, why you think we went wrong? I don't know if, as simple as that.
Okay. It was very interesting to read Raymond Suttner and his ideas on how the ANC has theorized the state. And that was a very interesting insight for me in a very kind of paternalistic idea of what the state is, that it is the provider, the deliverer. It is the deliverer for a better life for all. It does not enable delivery with multiple partners in explicit ways, even though probably that's what happens in reality. It's that it enables very specific kinds of development historically, which has a historical momentum. But I think the ways that the ANC has theorized itself as a paternalistic state means that kind of the political life of other constituencies has diminished. And I think that monopoly kind of on the political arena is part of the reason why state capture was able to kind of network itself into all pockets, financials, social currencies in our country. And I also think our inability to deal with race and have institutions kind of enforce the rules in an oversight way was the inability to call out people who are Black, who were doing things that other people didn't agree with and other Black people didn't agree with. I think there would have been a great sense of disloyalty, not only along racial lines, but along political alliances and solidarities that have been built over a very long time. And I think the rhetoric of radical economic transformation was very effective. I think all of us grabbed onto some thread of it before we realized what was really happening. So to untangle kind of that nested complexity of alliance, of solidarity, of kind of doability, you know, like, are the rules rigged in favor only for certain players? Yes, they are. How do we change that? I don't know, but something's happening here that looks kind of interesting, but it wasn't transformative. It was, yeah, I'm just really struck by what we've lost in that predatory project. The amount of money, the amount of social capital, the amount of trust, the amount of state capability. Wow, it's so frightening. And I think it's a constant threat. It doesn't really go away. It's not like those networks have even been dismantled, or, you know, they've been perturbed, but they haven't been dismantled. They still exist. And so it's reasonable to assume that they operate and they have great potential within this transition to, like Janet, you know, says, kind of find a place at the table.
Nina, I actually very much want to jump in here and continue this conversation. So given that your discussion about, in a way, all the things that we lost with the state capture network, it seems a little bit in tension with the idea that you say, okay, look at this amazing network. Look at how intricately it's kind of got its fingers in absolutely every pocket of South Africa. Yeah. It could have served developmental ends. Could it have? Well, this is the question. So could that relationality by itself have served developmental ends? Or is there something else that has to be there that would, I mean, the state capture network, as powerful as it was, lost us a whole lot of things. It didn't work in the end. So what is different about a developmental networking like that? So that whole relational thing, if we had that and it was developmental rather than predatory, would it work?
The
question, I mean, yeah, it's like, are there other values in it that would make it impossible for that kind of networking to actually work? It's just a question, like consensus-based stuff, dialogue, consultation, democracy, negotiated settlements. Aren't all of those things counter to the efficiency of a predatory network that actually has power and works? So is it possible that you could have the very network that you have as the state capture network driven towards a different end, a developmental end, a humanitarian end. I mean, it would be wonderful if it could happen, but maybe there
Yes.
are reasons why it can't. Just a
Yeah.
question. I
Yeah.
don't want to be depressing, but
I think for me, if you look at the network of state capture actors and kind of where the efficiencies happened, there was almost like a triangle between ruling elites, state bureaucrats, and the private sector.
Mm.
And missing in that triangle is civil society.
yeah.
And so for me, the political capital of civil society is what could make that network more developmental in the ways that it asserts itself as a legitimate political actor. And in the ways that it builds up that political currency again, because we had it. And so I think it can be developmental in the ways that oversight is not administrative, but is a relational practice between partners. I think this idea of relational network is like, it's a great heuristic, you know, it's kind of naive to think you could impose this heuristic on real life and it'll just happen.
Yeah.
I don't think so. But I think it's an interesting way to understand how we can influence change and how practices that we used kind of in the interest of predatory projects could be almost like a template for more generative ones. But I think something else is needed, Andrea. Yes, it's like the heuristic itself is not the equation. And for me, it's definitely about the political currency and muscle of civil society. And so that there's not a triangle, you know, between elites, bureaucrats, and private sector.
Okay.
If I may ask a question,
do.
just a quick one. In light of all of these things that were happening during state capture, that was definitely like a subversion of our democracy, right? And now that there's this drive to rebuild institutions and rebuild government capacity with actors such as the PCC and all of that, my question would be, surely there would be some sort of a pushback against that rebuild project. Are there definite safeguards that are put in place, and what would those safeguards look like if we don't want a repeat of what has happened?
I don't know for myself, like really, what's been interesting to kind of glean from the literature is what makes an institution strong. And part of that answer is about the ability to enforce the rules, to make it work, to try and reach its institutional objectives. And I think some of our institutions, maybe like post 94, with a momentum of struggle, with a sense of enthusiasm that we had then, and the kind of partnering that happened across institutions was really interesting. Everybody, to a greater degree, understood their mandate and went a little bit beyond it to meet the other institution. And for me, that's really a good reminder It's not like we need to like rethink this whole thing completely. Like we've done well before, and institutions managed to reach like organizational objectives, if you want to call it, or like social objectives before. And what was present then? So for me, it's about people really understanding their own individual values in teams, in how they come together with others for purposeful work. So I think part of building kind of strong institutions is one of them, but not in the administrative sense, not in the ways where you're kind of preoccupied with structure, but more in the ways in which you are very aware of relationships of power and what's happening inside of organizations. I don't think we can say it will never happen again. For me, state capture has always been happening since South Africa, before the union, you know, so I don't think you can say like we can prevent it. I think we have to be vigilant about our exchanges, our coalitions, what it is we are identified as the mission, you know, or maybe we get together with people and we're not entirely clear about what our role is.
Nina, we're actually, I'm afraid, over time. Gary, is that an old hand? I hope it is.
Yeah,
No,
It's a new hand. You want a very, very quick...
I'm not sure that there's a quick response. It was just to say, you know, the PCC kind of comes at it in terms of the transitions that are coming. Its big focus is coal to renewables. For us in our city, the big transition for us is internal combustion engines to electric vehicles, because our entire industry is based on internal combustion engines. So we're not going to feel the transition in terms of coal to renewables, but other than in terms of load shedding and that. But you get the sense the PCC wants to manage the transition, that it thinks that it's going to be a smooth transition. And I don't know that there's been any transition in the planet's history that's been a smooth transition, you know, that it hasn't been a very bumpy ride in which there've been winners and losers, you know. And I suppose what they're trying to do is trying to even it out a bit, you know, and use it as a lever for transformation that hasn't happened in the last 25, 26, 30 years, you know. So so I mean, it's a very ambitious project, I think, you know.
Very ambitious. Very, very, very ambitious.
Yeah.
I really respect, while I have lots of questions and like, not sure's, I'm really respectful of the vision and the effort, because what I realized when I was interviewing these commissioners and members of the Secretariat was the strenuousness with which to form a new organization, have a massive national agenda and mission, which has never been possible before. You know, to kind of, you set it, but it's never happened justice in the ways that we had envisioned it. So yeah, and I'm accept criticisms leveled at it, and I can see where they're valid. And I'm really supportive.
Okay, I think we're going to have to stop there. Yeah, I think the note on which we should end there is enthusiasm. I love that word that you used at some point. That's what we need, I think. to inject into this network to make it as powerful as state capture. If we could all jump on board, I think our enthusiasm for it is probably partly what would, you know, make it more powerful. So let's just,
Enthusiasm is renewable fuel.
yeah. Nina, thank you so much. That was fascinating. We could carry on all day. We are over time, and I know that a couple of people have had to leave. So thank you very much. We'll have to end there. Have a wonderful weekend, and yes, energy.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Awesome, Nina, thank you. Thanks.
Cheers.